In the quiet town of Willow Creek, where hope had grown as scarce as summer rain, Mayor Clara Dawson had learned to live with the impossible. Her 14-year-old daughter Ivy had been blind for 3 years, victims of a rare disorder that stole her sight and left behind only darkness. Every specialist, every treatment, every prayer had led to the same devastating conclusion: permanent damage, no cure, no hope. Then Dr. Noah Hart arrived with his converted school bus clinic and a promise that sounded like madness. This widowed father and former military medic claimed he could help Ivy see again, using an experimental therapy that retrained the brain itself. But can a grieving doctor's desperate innovation truly restore what medicine says is lost forever? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Willow Creek's town square, where Clara Dawson stood at her office window, watching the familiar rhythm of small-town life unfold below. At 42, she carried herself with the measured grace of someone who had learned to navigate both public scrutiny and private sorrow. Her auburn hair, streaked with premature silver, was pulled back in a practical bun that spoke of efficiency rather than vanity. The mayoral office had been her sanctuary for 6 years, a place where she could focus on solving problems that had solutions. But some problems, she had learned, were beyond the reach of municipal authority. "Mom, I can hear you thinking again," came a voice from behind her. Ivy Dawson, 14 years old, with her mother's determined chin and her late father's gentle smile, sat at the conference table, her fingers dancing across the raised dots of a Braille textbook. Her movements were fluid, practiced, but Clara still felt a familiar tightness in her chest, watching her daughter navigate a world that had become impossibly small. "Just reviewing the budget reports," Clara replied, though they both knew that wasn't true. The real report she was reviewing was the one from Dr. Martinez at the Regional Medical Center, the same conclusion she'd heard from 7 other specialists over the past 3 years. Ivy's optic nerve damage was extensive, irreversible, permanent. The rare autoimmune condition that had stolen her sight at 11 had left behind scar tissue that no current medical intervention could address. Clara had stopped using the word hope around Ivy 2 years ago. Hope, she'd learned, was a luxury they couldn't afford. The stack of medical files on her desk told the story of their journey through the maze of specialists, experimental treatments, and expensive consultations that had drained their savings and, more importantly, their faith in miracles. Each folder represented another door that had closed, another expert who had looked at Ivy's test results and delivered the same devastating verdict with varying degrees of professional sympathy. "Mrs. Patterson's here for the zoning meeting," came Margaret's voice through the intercom. Margaret Henley had been the town clerk for 30 years, a woman whose efficiency was matched only by her discretion. She'd watched Clara juggle single motherhood and public service with the kind of quiet approval that meant everything in a small town. "Send her in," Clara said, forcing herself to turn away from the window. The morning light caught the silver frame on her desk, a photo of her, Ivy, and her late husband David, taken just months before the car accident that had claimed his life 6 years ago. Sometimes she wondered if David's death had somehow prepared her for Ivy's blindness, or if losing him had simply used up all her reserves of faith. Ivy gathered her materials with practiced efficiency, her white cane folded neatly beside her chair. At 14, she had adapted to blindness with a resilience that both amazed and broke Clara's heart. She'd learned Braille, navigated their home with confidence, and maintained her grades through audio textbooks and a special computer program. But Clara knew her daughter's world had shrunk to the size of their house, the school, and the few blocks between them. "I'll be at the library after school," Ivy said, standing with the careful grace of someone who had learned to move through space without sight. "Mrs. Chen said she got the new audiobooks I requested." Clara nodded, then caught herself. Even after 3 years, she still sometimes forgot that Ivy couldn't see her gestures. "That sounds perfect, sweetheart. I'll pick you up at 5. As Ivy left, trailing her cane along the familiar path to the door, Clara felt the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders like a familiar coat. She was the mayor of Willow Creek, population 8,742, a job that required her to project confidence and competence at all times. But she was also the mother of a blind teenager, a role that had taught her the limits of control and the price of acceptance. The zoning meeting dragged on for 2 hours, filled with the usual disputes about property lines and building permits. Clara listened with half her attention, nodding at appropriate moments while her mind wandered to the afternoon schedule. Ivy had a doctor's appointment, not for her eyes, those appointments had ended months ago, but for her annual physical. Even that simple routine had become complicated by Ivy's condition. The teenager who had once played soccer and climbed trees now struggled to maintain the fitness that sighted children took for granted. It was during the lunch break that Margaret knocked on her door with an expression Clara had learned to recognize, the look of someone bearing news that would complicate an already complicated day. "There's a man outside with some kind of medical vehicle," Margaret said, her voice carrying the mixture of curiosity and concern that small-town emergencies always generated. "Says he's looking for the mayor, has a little boy with him." Clara glanced out her window and saw it immediately. Converted school bus painted white with red crosses, professional medical equipment visible through the windows. A tall man in his late 30s stood beside it, his dark hair touched with grey at the temples, wearing jeans and a button-down shirt that suggested competence without formality. A small boy, maybe 8 or 9, sat on the bus steps, swinging his legs and watching the town square with the intense curiosity of childhood. "Did he say what he wants?" Clara asked. "Something about offering medical services to the community. Said he heard about—" Margaret paused, the careful pause of someone who had learned to navigate sensitive subjects. "Said he heard about Ivy." Clara's chest tightened. Word of Ivy's condition had spread beyond Willow Creek, as news inevitably did in small towns. They'd received their share of well-meaning advice over the years, shown remedies, prayer circles, and the occasional charlatan promising miracle cures. She'd learned to handle these encounters with polite firmness, protecting both Ivy's privacy and their own emotional reserves. "I'll see him," she said, gathering her composure like armor. "But keep it brief." The man introduced himself as Dr. Noah Hart, and Clara immediately noticed his hand surgeon's hands, she thought, long-fingered and steady. His eyes, a warm brown, carried the kind of weariness that came from seeing too much suffering, but also a determination that suggested he hadn't given up fighting it. "Mayor Dawson," he said, his voice carrying a slight southern accent that spoke of roots somewhere warmer than Montana. "I appreciate you taking the time to see me. I know you must be busy." "What can I do for you, Dr. Hart?" Clara kept her tone professional, though something about the man's presence suggested this wasn't going to be a routine encounter. "I'm a traveling physician," he said, gesturing toward the bus. "I provide medical services to rural communities that might not otherwise have access to specialized care. I heard about your daughter's condition, and I wanted to offer my services." Clara felt the familiar defensive wall rise up. "I appreciate your concern, but Ivy has been seen by numerous specialists. Her condition is permanent," Noah finished gently. "I know. I've read the reports." That stopped her. "I'm sorry, what reports?" "Dr. Martinez shared Ivy's case with a colleague of mine at the Veterans Hospital. With your permission, of course, all properly anonymized. But I recognized the symptoms immediately. I've seen similar cases in my work with military personnel." Clara's professional instincts kicked in. "And you are?" "Veterans counselor and medical researcher. I specialize in neurological rehabilitation, particularly vision-related trauma. I've been working with experimental therapies that help the brain reinterpret damaged visual signals." The words hung in the air between them like a challenge. Clara had heard similar promises before, from doctors who meant well but understood neither the depth of Ivy's damage nor the family's exhaustion with false hope. "Dr. Hart," she said carefully, "I'm sure your work with veterans is important and valuable, but Ivy's condition is different." The optic nerve damage is extensive, and every specialist we've consulted has confirmed that current medical technology cannot repair it. Noah nodded slowly. You're right, current medical technology can't repair optic nerve damage. But that's not what I'm proposing. Something in his tone made Clara look more closely at him. Behind the professional demeanor, she glimpsed something that looked like personal pain, the kind that came from intimate knowledge of loss. What exactly are you proposing? She asked. The brain, Noah said, is remarkably adaptable. Even when the optic nerve is damaged, there are often residual pathways that can be retrained to carry visual information. The therapy I've developed doesn't repair the damage, it teaches the brain to work around it. Clara felt a familiar stirring that she immediately tried to suppress. Hope was dangerous. Hope led to disappointment, and disappointment led to the kind of pain that took months to heal. But something about Noah's quiet confidence, the way he spoke about the brain's adaptability with the reverence of someone who had witnessed miracles, made her pause. How successful has this therapy been? She asked. In military applications, about 60% of patients show significant improvement. Civilian applications are still experimental, but the early results are promising. 60%. Clara turned the number over in her mind, trying to reconcile it with 3 years of medical certainty. And you're offering this to Ivy? I'm offering to try, Noah said. I can't promise results, but I can promise that the therapy is safe and that I won't give up easily. Through the window, Clara could see the small boy still sitting on the bus steps, now drawing in a notebook with the focused intensity of childhood. Something about the scene, the converted bus, the determined doctor, the child waiting patiently, struck her as both absurd and deeply moving. Why? She asked. Why would you come all this way for a case you can't even be sure you can help? Noah's expression shifted, revealing a vulnerability that professional confidence couldn't quite mask. Because, he said quietly, I know what it's like to be told that nothing more can be done. And I know what it's like to wish you'd tried one more thing. The words carried weight that spoke of personal experience, of regrets and second chances. Clara recognized the tone she'd heard it in her own voice often enough. I'd need to think about it, she said. Discuss it with Ivy. Research your credentials, your success rates, the risks involved. Of course, Noah agreed. I wouldn't expect anything less from a responsible parent or a careful public servant. He handed her a business card that listed credentials from impressive institutions: Johns Hopkins, the VA Medical Center, the Defense Department's Rehabilitation Research Division. At the bottom, in smaller print, was a personal note. Father to Milo, age 8, believer in second chances. How long would this therapy take? Clara asked. 6 weeks, Noah said. Maybe less if we see rapid progress, possibly longer if the response is gradual. I'd need to set up a proper treatment space somewhere with good natural light and room for the equipment. Clara thought of the abandoned greenhouse at the edge of town, a relic from the days when Willow Creek had supported more agriculture. It had been sitting empty for 5 years, its glass panels still intact, but its purpose forgotten. Dr. Hart, she said, I want to be clear about something. Ivy has been through enough disappointment. If you're offering false hope or experimental treatment that's more about your research than her welfare, I need to know now. Noah met her gaze steadily. I'm offering the best treatment I know how to provide, based on methods that have helped other patients with similar conditions. I'm not offering miracles, but I am offering possibility. Sometimes that's enough. Outside, the little boy had finished his drawing and was now watching the conversation through the window with the frank curiosity of childhood. When he saw Clara looking, he waved with the unself-conscious friendliness that made her smile despite herself. That's Milo, Noah said, following her gaze. He's been my traveling companion for the past year, lost his mother 2 years ago, and we've been finding our way together ever since. The admission explained the sadness Clara had glimpsed in Noah's eyes. A widowed father, traveling from town to town with his young son, offering hope to families like hers. It was either the most beautiful thing she'd ever heard, or the most heartbreaking. I'll need to discuss this with Ivy tonight, Clara said. "And I'll want to verify your credentials, speak with some of your previous patients if possible." "Absolutely," Noah agreed. "I'll be staying at the motel on Route 9 for the next few days. Take all the time you need." As Noah and Milo drove away in their converted bus, Clara stood at her window, watching until they disappeared around the corner. The stack of medical files on her desk seemed to mock her with their finality, their absolute certainty that Ivy's blindness was permanent and irreversible. But for the first time in 3 years, Clara found herself wondering if absolute certainty was just another word for giving up. That evening, Clara sat across from Ivy at their kitchen table, the familiar ritual of homework and dinner providing a comfortable backdrop for an uncomfortable conversation. The verification of Noah's credentials had taken most of the afternoon calls to Johns Hopkins, the VA Medical Center, and 3 former patients who spoke of Dr. Hart with the reverence usually reserved for saints or miracle workers. "There's someone I'd like you to meet," Clara began, choosing her words with the care of someone who had learned that hope could be as fragile as spun glass. Ivy's fingers paused over her Braille textbook. At 14, she had developed an uncanny ability to read the emotional temperature of a room, compensating for her lost sight with heightened sensitivity to voice, gesture, and the subtle cues that sighted people took for granted. "Another doctor," Ivy said. It wasn't a question. Clara felt her carefully prepared speech crumble. "Yes, but this one is different. They're always different, Mum, until they're not." The resignation in Ivy's voice cut deeper than anger would have. Clara remembered the bright, fearless girl who had climbed every tree in their backyard and demanded to know why the sky was blue. That girl had been replaced by someone cautious, someone who had learned to protect herself by expecting nothing. "His name is Dr. Noah Hart. He has a son about your age, and he's been working with patients who have similar conditions to yours. He thinks—" Clara stopped, unwilling to voice the hope that had been building in her chest since the afternoon. "He thinks he can help me see again," Ivy finished. "He thinks it's possible." Ivy set down her stylus with deliberate precision. "Mom, we've been through this. Dr. Martinez, Dr. Peterson, Dr. Williams, they all said the same thing. The damage is permanent. There's no cure. But what if they were wrong? What if there's something they didn't consider?" Clara watched as Ivy turned toward the window, a gesture that had become habit, even though she couldn't see the view beyond the glass. The late afternoon light caught the fine bones of her face, highlighting the determined set of her jaw that she'd inherited from her father. "What if he's wrong?" Ivy asked quietly. "What if we go through 6 weeks of treatment and tests and hope, and I'm still blind at the end of it? What if I start believing I might see your face again, and then I don't?" The question hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they should cross. Clara had spent 3 years building walls around her own hope, protecting both of them from the crushing weight of disappointed expectations. But Noah's quiet confidence had shaken something loose in those walls, and she found herself remembering what it felt like to believe in possibilities. "Then we'll be exactly where we are now," Clara said. "Except we'll know we tried everything." The next morning, they drove to Noah's motel in Clara's practical sedan, Ivy's white cane folded neatly in her lap. The converted school bus was parked in the lot, looking somehow both professional and whimsical with its clean white paint and carefully stenciled medical symbols. Noah met them at the bus door, and Clara immediately noticed the way he spoke directly to Ivy, rather than addressing her questions to Clara, small courtesy that many adults forgot. "Ivy," he said, "I'm glad you decided to come. I know this must feel overwhelming." "It does," Ivy admitted, with the frankness that Clara had learned to expect from her daughter. "But Mom says you might be able to help." "I might be," Noah agreed. "But first, I need to understand exactly what we're working with. Would you mind if I examined your eyes? I promise it won't hurt." Inside the bus, Clara was struck by the transformation from school transportation to medical facility. The seats had been removed and replaced with sophisticated diagnostic equipment, treatment stations, and a small consultation area that managed to feel both clinical and welcoming. Milo sat in a corner, quietly working on what appeared to be a complex Lego construction, occasionally glancing up to offer encouraging smiles. Noah's examination was thorough but gentle, using handheld devices to measure light response and optic nerve function. Clara watched his face carefully, looking for signs of the disappointment she'd seen so many times before the moment when a new doctor realized that Ivy's case was as hopeless as all the others had claimed. But Noah's expression remained thoughtful, even optimistic. "The good news," he said finally, "is that there's definitely residual nerve function. The damage is extensive, but it's not complete. There are pathways that could potentially be retrained." Clara felt her heart skip. Meaning? Meaning that the experimental therapy might work. "I can't promise restored vision, but I can promise improvement." The question is whether you're both willing to try something that's never been attempted in a case like this. Ivy was quiet for a long moment, her face turned toward the sound of Noah's voice. "What would the treatment involve?" Noah pulled out a tablet and began showing them images of the equipment he used: light therapy devices, neural stimulation units, and computer programs designed to retrain visual processing pathways. "We'd start with basic light sensitivity training and gradually work up to pattern recognition and spatial awareness. The sessions would be daily, about 2 hours each, for 6 weeks. "And you think it might work?" Ivy asked. "I think it's worth trying," Noah said, "but I need you to understand that this is experimental. There are no guarantees, and the process can be emotionally difficult. You'd be training your brain to see in ways it's forgotten how to process." Clara found herself thinking about the abandoned greenhouse at the edge of town, its glass walls and forgotten potential. Where would these sessions take place? "I'd need a space with good natural light and room for the equipment. Somewhere we could set up a controlled environment for the therapy." "I might have a solution for that," Clara said slowly. "There's an old greenhouse that's been abandoned for years. It would need some work, but the bones are good." Noah's eyes lit up with interest. "That could be perfect. Natural light is crucial for this type of therapy." As they talked logistics, Clara noticed Milo approaching Ivy with the careful politeness of a child who had learned to navigate adult conversations. "Hi," he said simply. "I'm Milo. My dad helps people see better." Ivy smiled, the first genuine smile Clara had seen in weeks. "I'm Ivy. Your dad thinks he might be able to help me. He's really good at helping people," Milo said with the absolute confidence that children reserved for their parents. "And I'm good at helping too. I can read really well, and I know how to make paper airplanes that fly really far." The easy acceptance in the boy's voice seemed to unlock something in Ivy. Clara watched as her daughter's defensive posture softened, responding to friendship that came without pity or careful navigation around her blindness. That afternoon, Clara called an emergency session with the city council to discuss Noah's proposal. The response was immediate and predictably divided. "This is exactly the kind of liability issue we cannot afford," said Councilman Richards, a man whose political ambitions had always been larger than Willow Creek could contain. "What happens when this experimental treatment fails? Who's responsible when the family sues us for false hope?" "The treatment would be voluntary," Clara argued, "and Dr. Hart carries full medical malpractice insurance." "That's not the point," Richards continued. "The point is that we're a small town, not a research hospital. We don't have the resources or expertise to oversee experimental medical procedures." But Margaret Henley, whose opinion carried significant weight despite her unofficial status, spoke up quietly. "That little girl has been through enough heartbreak. If there's even a chance this could help her, don't we owe it to her to try?" The debate continued for 2 hours, touching on everything from insurance liability to the town's reputation. In the end, the vote was narrow, 4-3, in favor of allowing Noah to proceed, with the stipulation that all liability would rest with him personally. That evening, Clara found herself holding an old, tarnished key to the abandoned greenhouse that would either become Ivy's pathway to sight or another monument to disappointed hope. The key felt heavy in her hand, weighted with possibility and risk in equal measure. "Are we really going to do this?" Ivy asked from the kitchen doorway, her uncanny ability to sense Clara's location still startling after 3 years. Clara looked at her daughter, this brave, resilient girl who had adapted to blindness with grace but had never stopped dreaming of seeing the world again. The medical files on her desk declared the case hopeless, but sometimes hope was bigger than medical certainty. "Yes," Clara said, closing her fingers around the key, "we're going to try." Outside, the evening light slanted through their windows with the golden quality that photographers prized and painters tried to capture. Ivy couldn't see it, but for the first time in 3 years, Clara allowed herself to imagine a future where her daughter might witness a sunset again. The key to the greenhouse felt like a key to possibility, itself tarnished by time and neglect, but still capable of opening doors that had seemed permanently closed. Tomorrow, they would begin the process of transformation, turning an abandoned space into a place where miracles might unfold. Clara slipped the key into her pocket and smiled at her daughter. Sometimes the most important journeys began with the simple decision to unlock a door and see what lay beyond. The abandoned greenhouse stood at the edge of Willow Creek like a forgotten cathedral, its glass panels catching the morning light in fractured rainbows that danced across the overgrown floor. Clara pushed open the heavy door, releasing the scent of earth and time, while Noah surveyed the space with the calculating eye of someone who saw potential where others saw decay. "It's perfect," he said, his voice echoing slightly in the empty space. "The natural light exposure is excellent, and there's enough room for all the equipment we'll need." Over the next week, the greenhouse underwent a transformation that became the talk of Willow Creek. Noah worked alongside a crew of local volunteers, clearing decades of accumulated debris and installing the specialized equipment that would become Ivy's pathway to sight. Clara found herself stopping by each evening after work, drawn by the purposeful activity and the growing sense that something important was taking shape. The first light sensor, a small, sophisticated device no bigger than a smartphone, became the centerpiece of the treatment area. Noah explained its function to Clara and Ivy during their orientation session, his hands gentle and sure as he demonstrated its capabilities. "This measures the faintest response to light stimulus," he said, holding the device so Ivy could feel its smooth surface. "It's sensitive enough to detect neural activity that even the patient can't consciously perceive. It'll help us track progress, even when you don't feel like anything is happening." Ivy's first session was scheduled for a Monday morning, and Clara took the day off work to be present. She hadn't realized how nervous she was until she found herself changing outfits twice, as if the right clothes could somehow influence the outcome of an experimental medical procedure. The greenhouse had been transformed into something between a medical facility and a garden sanctuary. Noah's equipment was arranged in stations throughout the space, connected by carefully planned pathways that Ivy could navigate safely. Plants had been strategically placed to provide both aesthetic comfort and practical light filtration. The overall effect was professional, yet welcoming, a place where science and hope could coexist. "We're going to start very slowly," Noah explained, as he helped Ivy settle into the treatment chair positioned at the center of the space. "The first few sessions are about establishing baseline measurements and getting your brain accustomed to the stimulation." Milo had appointed himself as unofficial cheerleader, setting up his homework station in a corner where he could offer encouragement without interfering with the delicate work. His presence seemed to calm Ivy in ways that adult reassurance couldn't match. The light sensor registered its first reading as Noah activated the preliminary stimulation sequence. Clara watched the small screen, her heart racing as numbers and wavelength patterns flickered across the display. To her untrained eye, the data was meaningless, but Noah's expression suggested cautious optimism. "There's definitely activity," he murmured, adjusting settings with the precision of a musician tuning an instrument. "Your optic nerves are responding to the stimulation, even if you can't feel it yet." Ivy sat perfectly still, her face turned toward the light source, with an expression of intense concentration. "I don't see anything," she said quietly. Should I be seeing something? Not necessarily, Noah assured her. At this stage, we're working below the threshold of conscious perception. Your brain is processing the signals, but it may take time before that processing translates into actual vision. Clara found herself holding her breath as the session continued, watching for any sign that 3 years of medical certainty might be wrong. The light sensor continued its quiet monitoring, documenting responses that existing medical technology had declared impossible. After an hour, Noah powered down the equipment and helped Ivy from the treatment chair. "How do you feel?" he asked. Ivy considered the question carefully. "Tired, but not bad tired. More like I don't know. Like I've been thinking really hard about something." "That's exactly what your brain has been doing," Noah confirmed. "The neural pathways we're targeting haven't been used in 3 years. It's like asking muscles to work after a long period of inactivity." As they prepared to leave, Clara noticed that community members had begun gathering outside the greenhouse. Word of the experimental treatment had spread through Willow Creek with the speed that only small-town news could achieve. Some faces showed curiosity, others skepticism, and a few displayed the kind of concern that bordered on disapproval. Mrs. Henderson from the flower shop approached as they emerged. "How did it go, dear?" she asked Ivy with the gentle intrusion that came naturally to long-time neighbors. "It went well," Ivy replied diplomatically. "Dr. Hart says it'll take time to see results." "Of course it will," Mrs. Henderson agreed. "These things always do. You just keep your chin up, sweetheart." But Clara caught the skeptical glance Mrs. Henderson exchanged with her companion, a look that clearly communicated doubt about the wisdom of subjecting a child to experimental procedures. The weight of public opinion, even well-meaning public opinion, added another layer of pressure to an already delicate situation. That evening, as Clara reviewed the day's events with Ivy over dinner, she found herself studying her daughter's face for any sign of change. The rational part of her mind knew that improvement, if it came at all, would be gradual and subtle. But the hopeful part of her heart looked for miracles in every expression, every gesture, every turn of Ivy's head toward light. "Mom, you're staring," Ivy said with the amused tolerance of a teenager who had grown accustomed to being the object of anxious observation. "Sorry," Clara said, embarrassed to be caught. "I'm just hoping," Ivy finished. "I know, I'm hoping too, but Dr. Hart said we need to be patient." The next morning brought Clara's first real challenge as mayor since agreeing to support Noah's treatment. Councilman Richards had scheduled an emergency meeting to discuss the liability issues surrounding the experimental medical procedures being conducted within city limits. The meeting was tense from the moment Clara called it to order. Richards had clearly been building support for his position, and several council members who had voted in favor of the treatment now seemed to be having second thoughts. "I've been in contact with our insurance company," Richards announced, his tone suggesting he'd uncovered information that would settle the matter definitively. "They're concerned about our exposure if something goes wrong with this experimental treatment." "Dr. Hart carries full medical malpractice coverage," Clara reminded the council. "The city's liability is minimal." "Minimal isn't the same as non-existent," Richards countered, "and that's not even considering the reputational risk. What happens to Willow Creek's image if this treatment fails spectacularly? What happens if we become known as the town that subjected a disabled child to experimental procedures?" Margaret Henley spoke up from the back of the room, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had watched the town's politics evolve for 3 decades. "What happens if we become known as the town that was too afraid to help one of our own children?" The debate continued for an hour, touching on everything from medical ethics to municipal responsibility. Clara found herself defending not just Noah's treatment, but the broader principle that sometimes taking risks was better than accepting defeat. "Ivy has been blind for 3 years," she said finally. "Every conventional treatment has failed. If there's even a small chance that Dr. Hart's therapy could help her, don't we have an obligation to allow her to try?" In the end, the council voted to continue supporting the treatment, but the margin was narrower than before. Clara left the meeting with the uncomfortable awareness that political winds could shift quickly and that public support for the experiment might prove as fragile as the hope it represented. Back at the greenhouse, Noah was calibrating equipment for Ivy's second session. The light sensor sat ready, its small screen blank, but somehow full of potential. Clara watched as he made minute adjustments to the stimulation parameters, his movements deliberate and confident. "How are you feeling about the political pressure?" he asked, without looking up from his work. Clara was surprised by the directness of the question. "I didn't realize you'd heard about the council meeting." "Small town," Noah said with a slight smile. "Word travels fast, especially when it concerns the mayor's daughter and the stranger with the converted bus." "Some people think we're taking unnecessary risks," Clara admitted. "They're worried about liability, about what happens if the treatment doesn't work." Noah finally looked up from his equipment, his brown eyes serious. "And what do you think?" Clara considered the question carefully. "I think we're taking necessary risks. There's a difference." That afternoon, as Ivy settled into the treatment chair for her second session, the light sensor registered its first significant spike in neural activity. The change was subtly slight increase in the amplitude of the brain's response to light stimulation, but Noah's expression suggested it was meaningful. "What does that mean?" Clara asked, studying the patterns on the small screen. "It means her brain is starting to remember how to process visual information," Noah said quietly. "It's early yet, but it's exactly what we want to see." Ivy sat perfectly still during the session, her face turned toward the light with an expression of intense focus. When Noah asked how she felt afterward, she paused before answering. "Different," she said finally, "like something is waking up that's been asleep for a long time." Clara felt a flutter of something that might have been hope, carefully contained but undeniably present. The light sensor had registered change, subtle but measurable. After years of medical reports declaring improvement impossible, the small device offered the first evidence that Ivy's brain was capable of more than anyone had believed. As they walked home through the familiar streets of Willow Creek, Clara found herself looking at the world with new eyes, wondering what Ivy might see if the treatment worked. What colors and shapes and expressions had been lost to darkness but might someday be recovered. The light sensor remained in the greenhouse, ready for tomorrow's session, its sophisticated technology condensed into a device small enough to hold in one hand. But its significance was enormous, a bridge between medical impossibility and the faintest spark of hope that maybe, just maybe, the experts had been wrong about what could and couldn't be healed. 2 weeks into the treatment, Noah's progress journal had become Clara's secret obsession. The leather-bound notebook, with its careful documentation of each session's measurements and observations, represented something she had almost forgotten existed, hope backed by evidence. "Day 14, Noah wrote in his precise handwriting as Ivy completed her morning session. Light sensitivity increased by 12% from baseline. Patient reports occasional awareness of brightness changes during daily activities. Neural response patterns show consistent improvement." Clara read the entry over his shoulder, her heart racing at the clinical language that somehow made miracles sound routine. After 3 years of medical reports that documented decline and limitation, Noah's journal offered a different narrative of gradual but measurable progress towards something that had been declared impossible. 12%, she repeated quietly. "That's good?" "That's very good," Noah confirmed, closing the journal with care. "Especially at this stage, we're seeing exactly the kind of neural adaptation I'd hoped for." Ivy sat in the treatment chair, her face turned toward the afternoon light streaming through the greenhouse glass. Something about her posture had changed over the past 2 weeks. She seemed more alert, more engaged with her environment in ways that Clara was only beginning to understand. "I think I saw something yesterday," Ivy said suddenly, her voice carrying the careful uncertainty of someone afraid to trust her own perception. Clara and Noah both froze. This was the first time Ivy had reported any visual experience since the treatment began. "Tell me about it," Noah said gently, his tone carefully neutral. I was walking to the library, and there was this moment where the darkness seemed lighter, like there was a difference between the shadow of the building and the open sky. Ivy paused, her brow furrowed in concentration. It only lasted a second, and I wasn't sure if I was imagining it. Noah made a note in his journal, his expression thoughtful. That's called brightness discrimination, and it's often the first type of visual perception to return. Your brain is starting to process the difference between light and shadow. Clara felt tears gathering in the corners of her eyes. For 3 years, Ivy's world had been uniformly dark. The possibility that she might be beginning to distinguish between different levels of darkness felt like witnessing a sunrise after an endless night. But the progress came with complications that Clara hadn't anticipated. Word of Ivy's reported visual experience spread through Willow Creek within hours, carried by the invisible network of small-town communication that made privacy nearly impossible. By evening, Clara's phone was ringing with calls from well-meaning neighbors, curious reporters, and medical professionals who wanted to know more about the experimental treatment. "Mrs. Dawson, this is Dr. Patricia Wells from Channel 7 News," came one particularly persistent voice. "We'd like to do a feature story on your daughter's miraculous recovery. When would be a good time to set up an interview?" Clara declined politely but firmly, protective of both Ivy's privacy and the delicate nature of the treatment process. But the attention was unsettling, transforming their personal journey into a public spectacle that felt increasingly difficult to control. The political pressure intensified as well. Councilman Richards called Clara at home that evening, his voice tight with barely controlled frustration. "This is getting out of hand," he said without preamble. "I've had 3 calls from state health officials asking about the experimental medical procedures we're allowing within city limits. The liability issues alone could bankrupt us if something goes wrong." "Nothing is going wrong," Clara replied, though she could hear the defensive edge in her own voice. "Ivy is showing improvement. The treatment is working." "Alleged improvement," Richards corrected, "based on the subjective reports of a child who desperately wants to see again. That's not the same thing as objective medical evidence." But Noah's journal contained objective evidence, careful measurements, and documented neural responses that painted a clear picture of gradual improvement. Clara found herself returning to the greenhouse each evening, not just to support Ivy, but to witness the quiet miracle of scientific documentation proving what skeptics claimed was impossible. The journal had become more than a medical record. It was a testament to persistence in the face of professional doubt. Each entry built upon the last, creating a narrative of hope, supported by data that even the most skeptical observer would have to acknowledge. Day 16, Noah wrote after Ivy's latest session. Patients successfully identified the difference between direct sunlight and filtered light in controlled testing. Neural response patterns show continued strengthening of visual processing pathways. Milo had become an unofficial assistant in the documentation process, helping his father organize equipment and serving as Ivy's enthusiastic cheerleader. The 8-year-old's presence brought a lightness to the greenhouse that balanced the intensity of the medical procedures. "Dad, can Ivy see my paper airplane yet?" he asked during one afternoon session, holding up a carefully folded creation that he'd been perfecting for days. "Not yet," Noah replied patiently, "but her brain is learning to process light and shadow. That's the first step toward seeing shapes and movement." Ivy smiled at the question, her face turning toward Milo's voice with the automatic precision she'd developed over 3 years of blindness. "When I can see it, I want it to be the first thing I really look at," she promised. The friendship between Ivy and Milo had developed with the easy naturalness that Clara remembered from her own childhood, uncomplicated by the careful sympathy that characterized most of Ivy's interactions with adults. Milo treated her blindness as simply another characteristic, no more significant than her hair color or her preference for chocolate ice cream. "Mom says you're going to be able to see again," Milo announced with the absolute certainty that children brought to the promises of trusted adults. "She used to not be able to walk after her accident, but the doctors helped her get better. Clara looked at Noah sharply. This was the first she'd heard about an accident or about Milo's mother's medical struggles. "Your mom had an accident?" Ivy asked gently. Milo nodded, then caught himself and added verbally, "Yeah, a car hit her when she was riding her bike. The doctor said she might not walk again, but Dad helped her do exercises every day until she could. Then she got sick and died, but that was different." The casual way Milo spoke about his mother's death and recovery revealed the matter-of-fact acceptance that children often brought to tragedy. But Clara could see the tightness around Noah's eyes that suggested the loss was still raw, still painful. That evening, as Clara and Noah reviewed the day's progress notes, she found herself studying the man who had walked into their lives with promises that sounded like fantasy. His quiet competence and gentle manner with Ivy had earned her trust, but she realized she knew very little about the personal losses that had shaped his dedication to helping others. "Milo mentioned his mother's accident," she said carefully. "I'm sorry for your loss." Noah's hands stilled on the journal pages. Sarah was a physical therapist. She understood the importance of persistence in rehabilitation. After her accident, she insisted on trying experimental treatments that other doctors said were pointless. He paused, his voice growing quieter. "She taught me that sometimes the medical establishment gives up too early." The admission explained much about Noah's willingness to pursue treatments that conventional medicine had dismissed. His work with Ivy wasn't just professional dedication, it was personal mission, informed by love and loss. "Is that why you're here?" Clara asked. "Because Sarah believed in fighting impossible odds?" "Sarah believed that hope, backed by science, was never wasted effort," Noah replied. "Even when the outcome isn't what you want, the attempt matters, the knowledge gained matters. The possibility that you might be wrong about what's impossible that matters most of all." As if summoned by their conversation about possibilities, Ivy appeared in the greenhouse doorway, her white cane tapping lightly against the frame. "I wanted to practice walking the path again," she said. "Something feels different about the way the light hits the glass panels. I think I might be able to tell when clouds pass over the sun." Clara and Noah exchanged glances. Cloud recognition represented a significant advancement in visual processing, the ability to detect subtle changes in light intensity that required sophisticated neural interpretation. They watched as Ivy made her way carefully along the predetermined path, her cane tapping softly against the ground, while her face turned upward toward the glass ceiling. At one point, she stopped and tilted her head, as if listening to something only she could hear. "There," she said quietly. "The light just changed. Did a cloud move across the sun?" Clara looked up through the greenhouse glass and confirmed what Ivy had somehow perceived. Large cloud had indeed passed across the afternoon sun, dimming the natural light by perhaps 10%. Noah made a note in his journal, his handwriting quick and excited. "Day 17 addendum," he wrote. "Patient demonstrates environmental light awareness beyond controlled testing parameters, spontaneous recognition of natural light variation." The entry represented more than medical progress. It documented the return of a connection between Ivy and the world beyond her immediate reach. For the first time in 3 years, she was aware of the sky above her head, the weather patterns that affected the quality of light, the vast environment that existed beyond the boundaries of touch and sound. As they walked home through the familiar streets of Willow Creek, Clara found herself looking up at the clouds that Ivy had somehow sensed. The sky seemed different now, not just a backdrop for daily life, but an active participant in her daughter's gradual return to the visual world. Noah's journal tucked under her arm felt like carrying hope itself, leather-bound evidence that impossible things sometimes happened to families brave enough to try them. Each page documented not just medical measurements, but the slow miracle of a young girl's brain remembering how to see. Tomorrow would bring the 18th day of treatment, and Clara found herself eager to discover what new entry Noah would make in his careful record of progress. The journal had become their roadmap through uncharted territoria, place where hope and science converged to create possibilities that conventional wisdom said couldn't exist. 4 weeks into the treatment, the wind chime obstacle course had become the centerpiece of Ivy's rehabilitation. Noah had designed it with the precision of an engineer and the imagination of a child, dozens of delicate chimes suspended at various heights throughout the greenhouse, creating both auditory landmarks and gentle moving targets that Ivy's developing vision might eventually detect. The goal isn't just to navigate around the chimes, Noah explained as he made final adjustments to the course. It's to eventually see them moving, to distinguish between the light they reflect and the shadows they cast. Clara watched from the observation area as Ivy prepared for her daily navigation session. Her daughter's confidence had grown dramatically over the past week, her movements more fluid and purposeful as she learned to trust the subtle visual cues her brain was beginning to process. But the progress came with political costs that Clara was still learning to navigate. The morning's newspaper had carried a front-page story about Willow Creek's experimental medical procedures, complete with quotes from unnamed sources questioning the wisdom of subjecting a disabled child to unproven treatments. Mayor Dawson's decision to allow these experimental procedures within city limits raises serious questions about oversight and accountability, the article quoted. When conventional medicine has exhausted all options, perhaps acceptance is more appropriate than desperate measures. Clara had read the article 3 times before breakfast, each reading adding another layer of frustration and defensive anger. The unnamed sources were clearly people she worked with, neighbors she'd known for years, possibly even fellow council members who lacked the courage to voice their concerns directly. "Mom, you're thinking too loud again," Ivy called from the obstacle course, her voice carrying the gentle teasing that had become her way of managing Clara's anxiety. "Sorry, sweetheart," Clara replied, forcing herself to focus on the session rather than the political implications of their choice. Ivy moved through the wind chimes with increasing grace, her cane work supplemented by what appeared to be genuine spatial awareness. When a gentle breeze set the chimes in motion, she paused and turned her head, tracking the sound with a precision that suggested she might be detecting the subtle light changes created by the moving metal. "I think I can almost see them," she said during a rest break, her voice carrying the careful uncertainty of someone learning to trust unprecedented experiences. "Not really see, but know where they are, like they're blocking something that I can almost perceive." Noah made detailed notes in his progress journal, documenting not just Ivy's physical navigation of the course, but her growing confidence in describing her visual experiences. The vocabulary of sight was returning to her words like bright and shadow and movement that had been absent from her speech for 3 years. "This is exactly what we hope to see," Noah told Clara quietly while Ivy practiced. Her brain is building new pathways to process visual information. The chimes provide gentle stimulation that encourages those pathways to strengthen. But the morning's newspaper article had opened a floodgate of unwanted attention. By noon, Clara's office was fielding calls from reporters, medical ethicists, and government officials who wanted to know more about the experimental treatment being conducted in their small town. The most troubling call came from Dr. Amanda Rodriguez, a state medical board investigator, who informed Clara that they were opening a formal inquiry into Dr. Hart's credentials and treatment protocols. "This isn't a punitive investigation," Dr. Rodriguez assured her. "But when experimental medical procedures are conducted outside of traditional hospital settings, we have an obligation to ensure patient safety and treatment validity." Clara hung up the phone with the sick certainty that their carefully constructed sanctuary was about to become a battleground between hope and bureaucracy. The wind chime course that had seemed so beautiful and therapeutic suddenly felt fragile, vulnerable to forces that measured success in paperwork rather than progress. That afternoon, Noah received his own call from the medical board. Clara watched his face as he listened to questions about his qualifications, his treatment protocols, and his success rates with similar cases. His responses were professional and detailed, but she could see the tension in his shoulders as he defended work that he'd been doing successfully for years. They want complete documentation of Ivy's case, he told Clara after hanging up. Medical history, treatment protocols, progress measurements, informed consent, documentation, everything. Do we have everything they need? Clara asked. We have more documentation than most hospital-based treatments, Noah assured her, but I'm concerned about the timing. Official investigations can take months, and they might require us to suspend treatment while they review the case. The possibility of stopping Ivy's treatment, just as she was showing significant improvement, felt like being asked to abandon a rescue mission at the moment of breakthrough. Clara found herself caught between her responsibilities as mayor, protecting the town from liability and regulatory complications, and her role as mother to a daughter who was finally beginning to see hope made manifest. That evening's city council meeting was the most contentious Clara had experienced in her 6 years as mayor. The conference room was packed with residents, reporters, and what appeared to be at least 2 people with official-looking clipboards who refused to identify themselves when asked. Councilman Richards had clearly prepared for this moment, his presentation complete with printed copies of the morning's newspaper article and a legal brief outlining the city's potential liability exposure. We're talking about experimental medical procedures with no FDA approval, conducted by a doctor whose credentials, while impressive, don't specifically qualify him for this type of treatment, Richards announced to the packed room. The state medical board is investigating, the insurance company is asking questions, and now we have reporters calling this a case of small-town medical overreach. Clara listened to the familiar litany of concerns, each one valid in its own way, but collectively missing the central point that seemed so obvious to her: Ivy was getting better. The wind chime course that had seemed impossible to navigate a month ago was now a daily exercise in growing confidence and expanding awareness. Councilman Richards raises important points about oversight and accountability, Clara acknowledged when her turn came to speak. But I'd like to remind everyone why we're having this discussion. 4 weeks ago, my daughter hadn't perceived light or shadow in 3 years. Today, she can distinguish between direct sunlight and cloud cover. She can navigate an obstacle course that requires spatial awareness we were told her brain could never relearn. Margaret Henley spoke up from the back of the room, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had watched Willow Creek's politics evolve for decades. I've known Ivy since she was a baby. I've watched her adapt to blindness with more grace than most adults show in facing minor inconveniences. If there's a chance this treatment can help her, then our job as her community is to support that chance, not regulate it into impossibility. The debate continued for 2 hours, with speakers representing every perspective from cautious support to outright opposition. Clara found herself defending not just Noah's treatment, but the broader principle that sometimes taking calculated risks was more appropriate than accepting medical certainty. The vote, when it finally came, was closer than Clara had hoped, 4-3 in favor of continuing support for the treatment, but with new requirements for documentation and regular progress reports to be shared with the state medical board. As the meeting broke up, Clara noticed Noah standing quietly in the back of the room, Milo beside him with the patient expression of a child accustomed to adult meetings that determined his family's future. She made her way through the crowd to where they waited. "How much of that did you hear?" she asked. "Enough," Noah replied. "I appreciate the council's continued support, but I understand their concerns. Maybe it would be better if we—" "No," Clara interrupted with a firmness that surprised them both. "We're not stopping now, not when it's working." Noah studied her face for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Then we keep going, but we document everything twice as carefully, and we prepare for more scrutiny than we've faced so far." The next morning brought validation in the form of Dr. Sarah Chen, a neurologist from the regional medical center who had been quietly following Ivy's case. She arrived at the greenhouse with a portable EEG machine and a professional interest in Noah's unconventional methods. "I've been reviewing Dr. Hart's documentation," she told Clara, while observing Ivy's session with the wind chime course. The neural response patterns he's recording are consistent with genuine visual cortex activation. This isn't placebo effect or wishful thinking, this is measurable neurological improvement. Dr. Chen's presence added a layer of medical legitimacy that Clara hoped would satisfy at least some of the critics. More importantly, her independent testing confirmed what Noah's equipment had been showing. Ivy's brain was indeed relearning how to process visual information. The wind chime course is particularly clever, Dr. Chen observed as Ivy navigated between the gently moving obstacles. The combination of auditory cues and subtle light reflection provides exactly the kind of stimulation that encourages visual pathway development. As if responding to the praise, Ivy paused mid-course and tilted her head upward. The big chime near the windows moving differently than the others. The light is, she struggled for words to describe an experience that existed at the edges of her recovering perception. Brighter when it swings toward the glass. Clara felt her breath catch. Ivy was describing the reflection of sunlight off the polished surface of the largest wind chimera visual phenomenon that required not just light detection, but spatial reasoning and the ability to track movement across her visual field. Noah and Dr. Chen exchanged glances that spoke of professional excitement carefully contained. In the clinical language of neurological rehabilitation, Ivy had just demonstrated complex visual processing that conventional medicine had declared impossible. That's exactly right, Noah confirmed gently. The chime is catching sunlight and reflecting it as it moves. You're seeing the reflection. The word seeing hung in the air like a bridge between the world Ivy had lost and the world she was slowly reclaiming. Clara found herself remembering the first time her daughter had identified colors, the excitement of watching her discover the difference between blue and green. This felt similar to the joy of witnessing awareness expand into territories that had seemed permanently closed. As they prepared to leave the greenhouse, Clara noticed that the wind chime course had taken on new significance. What had begun as a therapeutic tool had become a symbol of possibility, dozens of delicate obstacles that Ivy was learning to navigate, not just with her cane and her hearing, but with the gradual return of sight that medical experts had said would never come. The chimes moved gently in the afternoon breeze, catching and reflecting light in patterns that Ivy was beginning to perceive. Each movement created opportunities for her recovering vision to practice tracking, focusing, and interpreting the visual information that her brain was slowly learning to process again. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, more scrutiny from officials, more pressure from skeptics, more documentation requirements from bureaucrats who measured miracles in paperwork. But today had brought confirmation that Ivy's progress was real, measurable, and continuing. The wind chimes sang softly in the afternoon light, their gentle music accompanying the quiet miracle of a young girl's brain remembering how to see. The fiber-optic garden transformed the greenhouse into something that belonged more in a fairy tale than a medical facility. Thousands of hair-thin strands of light, woven through carefully arranged plants, created a landscape of gentle illumination that responded to Ivy's movements like living art. Noah had spent weeks perfecting the installation, understanding that this phase of treatment required not just scientific precision, but emotional comfort. "It's beautiful," Clara whispered as she watched Ivy navigate the light-threaded pathways for the first time. "It looks like stars growing in a garden." Each fiber-optic strand was calibrated to provide specific wavelengths of light designed to stimulate different aspects of visual processing. As Ivy moved through the space, the lights created subtle patterns that challenged her recovering vision to distinguish between stationary and moving illumination, between direct and reflected light, between the gentle glow of the fibers and the natural sunlight filtering through the greenhouse glass. But the beauty of the installation couldn't mask the growing tension surrounding their experiment. The State Medical Board's investigation had intensified, with Dr. Rodriguez making unannounced visits that left everyone feeling scrutinized and defensive. More troubling was the political pressure building around Clara's position as mayor. I've been getting calls, Margaret confided during a brief break between morning appointments. People saying you're putting the town at risk, using your position to get special treatment for Ivy. Councilman Richards has been very busy building support for his concerns. Clara felt the familiar tightness in her chest that accompanied discussions of political vulnerability. She'd known that supporting Noah's treatment carried risks, but she hadn't fully anticipated how those risks would compound as Ivy's progress became more visible and more controversial. The morning session with the fiber optic garden yielded Ivy's most significant breakthrough yet. As she moved through the light-woven pathways, she suddenly stopped and turned toward a section where the fibers had been arranged in a deliberate pattern. "There's something different here," she said, her voice carrying the careful excitement of someone learning to trust unprecedented experiences. "The lights, they're not random, they make a shape." Noah had indeed programmed that section to display a simple geometric paterna square of slightly brighter illumination that was barely perceptible even to fully sighted observers. Ivy's ability to detect and recognize the pattern represented a quantum leap in visual processing capability. "Can you describe what you see?" Noah asked gently. Ivy stood perfectly still, her face turned toward the pattern with an expression of intense concentration. "It's like a window, a bright window in the middle of the other lights." Clara felt tears gathering in the corners of her eyes. After 3 years of absolute darkness, her daughter was describing geometric shapes, spatial relationships, the concept of a window visual metaphors that had been absent from her vocabulary since the onset of blindness. Noah made careful notes in his progress journal, documenting not just the successful pattern recognition, but Ivy's growing confidence in describing her visual experiences. The fiber optic garden was providing exactly the kind of gentle, controlled stimulation that encouraged neural pathway development without overwhelming her recovering visual cortex. But their celebration was interrupted by an unexpected visit from Dr. Rodriguez, accompanied this time by 2 officials from the State Health Department who introduced themselves with the bureaucratic authority that made Clara's mayoral instincts go on high alert. "Dr. Hart," Dr. Rodriguez said without preamble, "we need to discuss some concerns that have been raised about your treatment protocols." The officials spent an hour reviewing Noah's documentation, questioning his methods, and expressing skepticism about the progress reports that seemed to contradict established medical opinion about Ivy's condition. Clara watched Noah respond to their inquiries with professional patience, but she could see the frustration building behind his calm exterior. "The concern," explained Dr. Patricia Wells from the Health Department, "is that these alleged improvements may be creating false hope in the patient and family. When the treatment inevitably fails to produce lasting results, the psychological damage could be significant." "The improvements aren't alleged," Clara interjected with barely controlled anger. "My daughter can navigate obstacle courses that were impossible a month ago. She can detect patterns that trained medical professionals say she shouldn't be able to see. How is that false hope?" "Subjective improvements," Dr. Wells corrected smoothly. "Patient and family reports of progress aren't the same as objective medical evidence." Noah quietly handed over the EEG readings that Dr. Chen had conducted, along with detailed measurements from his own equipment, showing consistent improvement in neural response patterns. The officials reviewed the data with the kind of professional skepticism that seemed impervious to evidence. "We'll need to have these results independently verified," Dr. Rodriguez announced, "and we'll need to suspend treatment pending our complete review of the case." The words hit Clara like a physical blow. Suspend treatment, just as Ivy was making breakthrough progress, just as her brain was remembering how to process visual information that had been lost for 3 years. "You can't do that," she said, her voice carrying all the authority she could muster as an elected official. "This is working. You're asking us to stop a successful treatment because it doesn't fit your preconceptions about what's possible. We're asking you to follow proper medical protocols." Dr. Wells replied, "Experimental treatments require extensive oversight, especially when they involve minors with permanent disabilities." The meeting ended with an ultimatum: suspend treatment within 48 hours or face formal charges of conducting unauthorized medical procedures. Clara watched the officials leave with the sick certainty that bureaucracy was about to triumph over breakthrough, that politics would overrule the possibility of miracles. That evening, as Ivy practiced navigating the fiber-optic garden under Noah's careful supervision, Clara found herself studying the delicate strands of light that had become so much more than therapeutic tools. They represented the fragile nature of hope, its beautiful, effective, but vulnerable to forces that measured success in compliance rather than results. "Mom, you're thinking really loud tonight," Ivy called from the center of the light garden, her voice carrying the amused tolerance she'd developed for Clara's worry sessions. "Just watching you work," Clara replied, forcing herself to focus on her daughter rather than the political complications threatening to end their experiment. Ivy moved through the fiber-optic pathways with growing confidence, her movements guided by visual cues that conventional medicine insisted couldn't exist. The pattern recognition exercise had become routine, could now identify squares, circles, and triangles of light arranged among the random illumination. "The patterns are getting easier to see," Ivy reported during her cool-down session. "It's like my eyes are remembering how to pay attention to things." Noah made his evening notes in the progress journal, documenting another day of improvement in the face of mounting official pressure to abandon the treatment. The fiber-optic garden provided measurable evidence of visual processing that experts claimed was impossible, but evidence seemed to matter less than regulatory compliance. As they prepared to leave the greenhouse, Clara found herself touching one of the fiber-optic strands, feeling its delicate structure and marveling at how something so small could represent such enormous hope. The light garden had become a metaphor for Ivy's recovery, intricate, beautiful, and fragile enough that a single wrong move could destroy everything they'd built. "We're not stopping," she announced to Noah and Ivy as they gathered their things. "Whatever it takes, whatever the political cost, we're not stopping when it's working." Noah looked at her with an expression that mixed gratitude with concern. The state officials were serious about those charges. "If we continue treatment without their approval, then we'll face whatever consequences come," Clara interrupted. "Ivy is getting better. That matters more than bureaucratic approval." As they walked home through the familiar streets of Willow Creek, Clara found herself looking at the town with new eyes. The place that had been her political sanctuary for 6 years might soon become the site of her most important battle, no for re-election or policy implementation, but for the right to pursue impossible cures for impossible cases. The fiber-optic garden waited in the greenhouse, its thousands of gentle lights ready for tomorrow's session. Each strand represented a pathway toward vision, toward hope, toward the possibility that sometimes the experts were wrong about what could and couldn't be healed. Clara fell asleep that night, planning defiance, preparing to risk everything she'd built politically for the chance to give her daughter back the gift of sight. The delicate lights of the fiber-optic garden flickered in her dreams, weaving patterns of possibility that bureaucrats couldn't regulate and skeptics couldn't extinguish. The corporate buyout contract arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by courier to Noah's motel room with the kind of urgency that suggested life-changing decisions couldn't wait for convenient timing. Clara found Noah sitting at the small table by the window, the thick document spread before him like a map to territories he'd never intended to explore. $12 million, he said without looking up when she knocked and entered. "Neurovision Technologies wants to buy the exclusive rights to my therapy protocols." Clara felt the world shift slightly off its axis. $12 million was more money than Willow Creek's entire annual budget, more than enough to secure Milo's future through college and beyond. More than enough to transform a traveling physician into a financially secure researcher. "That's incredible," she managed, though something in Noah's tone suggested the offer wasn't entirely welcome news. Noah handed her the contract, its legal language dense with terms and conditions that would make a corporate lawyer proud. As Clara read, her initial excitement gave way to growing unease. The buyout included provisions that would require Noah to cease all current treatments immediately, relocate to Neurovision's research facility in California, and agree to conduct all future therapy development under corporate oversight. "They want you to stop treating Ivy," she said, the words feeling thick and strange in her mouth. "They want to control the therapy," Noah corrected. "All future treatments would be conducted in their facilities, with their patients, under their protocols. They're offering to make me wealthy in exchange for giving up everything I've built." Clara set the contract down carefully, as if it was something that might explode if handled roughly. "What are you going to do?" Noah's silence stretched long enough to serve as an answer in itself. She could see the conflict in his expression, the weight of responsibility for Milo's future balanced against his commitment to Ivy's recovery. The security of corporate backing measured against the freedom to practice medicine according to his own conscience. "I need to think about it," he said finally. "Milo deserves financial security. I can't ignore an opportunity that could change his entire life." Clara nodded, understanding the impossible position Noah found himself in. As a single parent herself, she knew the crushing weight of making decisions that affected not just your own future but your child's as well. But the timing felt deliberate, calculated to arrive just as Ivy was making breakthrough progress. "Who initiated the contact?" she asked. "How did they even know about your work here?" Noah's expression darkened. "That's what concerns me. Neurovision contacted me within hours of the State Medical Board's investigation. They knew details about Ivy's case, about the specific protocols we've been using, about the political pressure we're facing. Someone's been feeding them information." The implications hit Clara like a cold wind. The medical board investigation, the political pressure, the perfectly timed buyout offer all suggested a level of coordination that went beyond coincidental interest in experimental treatments. That afternoon, Clara's suspicions were confirmed when Margaret handed her a printed email that had been forwarded through 3 different accounts before reaching the town clerk's desk. "This came from a friend who works at the state capitol," Margaret said quietly. "She thought you should see it." The email chain revealed the disturbing reality behind the medical board investigation. Neurovision Technologies had been monitoring experimental vision therapy research across the country, identifying promising treatments that hadn't yet been protected by corporate patents. When they learned about Noah's success with military patients, they began a campaign to pressure him into selling his protocols. The Willow Creek case presents an ideal opportunity. Read one internal email. "Public failure of unregulated treatment will demonstrate need for corporate oversight while creating pressure for Dr. Hart to accept our acquisition offer." Clara read the email chain twice, her anger building with each exchange. The medical board investigation hadn't been motivated by patient safety concerns. It had been orchestrated by a corporation that wanted to acquire Noah's therapy and control its development and distribution. "They've been sabotaging us from the beginning," she told Noah when she found him at the greenhouse, making final adjustments to the fiber-optic garden for Ivy's afternoon session. "The investigation, the political pressure, the timing of this buyout offer, it's all been orchestrated to force you into selling." Noah listened to Clara's explanation with the grim resignation of someone who had learned not to be surprised by corporate manipulation. "That explains why the investigation has been so aggressive. They're not trying to protect patients, they're trying to create a crisis that makes their offer look like the only reasonable solution." The revelation transformed Clara's understanding of everything they'd been facing: the skeptical council members, the critical newspaper coverage. The bureaucratic obstacles, all of it, had been influenced by a corporate campaign designed to make independent medical research appear dangerous and irresponsible. "What does this mean for Ivy's treatment?" Clara asked. "It means we're running out of time," Noah replied. "Neurovision won't wait indefinitely for my answer. If I refuse their offer, they'll escalate the pressure until continuing treatment becomes impossible." That evening, Ivy's session with the fiber-optic garden yielded her most significant breakthrough yet. As she moved through the light-woven pathways, she suddenly stopped and pointed toward a section where no therapeutic lights had been installed. "There's someone watching us," she said with quiet certainty. Clara and Noah turned to follow her gaze and saw a figure standing just outside the greenhouse glass, someone with a camera or recording device, documenting their session without permission. When they moved toward the window, the figure retreated into the woods that bordered the greenhouse property. "They're building a case against us," Noah said grimly, "documenting everything we do so they can present it as evidence of reckless experimentation." The surveillance added a new layer of violation to their already complex situation. The greenhouse that had been their sanctuary was now a fishbowl, their every move monitored and recorded by people whose agenda had nothing to do with Ivy's welfare. But the most devastating blow came that evening when Clara received a phone call from Dr. Rodriguez. "Mayor Dawson," came the official voice that Clara had learned to associate with bad news. "I'm calling to inform you that we'll be conducting a formal hearing tomorrow morning to determine whether Dr. Hart's treatment should be permanently suspended. You and your daughter are required to attend." Clara felt the familiar tightness in her chest that accompanied political crises, but this was worse than any election or budget battle she'd faced. This was about Ivy's future, about the possibility of sight that might be taken away just as it was beginning to return. "On what grounds?" she asked. "Patient safety concerns," Dr. Rodriguez replied smoothly. "We've received reports that the experimental treatment may be causing false hope and psychological damage to a vulnerable minor." After hanging up, Clara found herself holding the corporate buyout contract that represented Noah's path to financial security and Milo's future. $12 million in exchange for abandoning everything he'd built, everyone he'd promised to help, every patient who might benefit from therapy that corporations wanted to control. "Dad, what's wrong?" Milo asked from the doorway, his 8-year-old intuition picking up on the tension that filled the room like smoke. Noah looked at his son, this bright, resilient boy who had lost his mother and adapted to a life of constant travel, who deserved stability and security and the chance to grow up without worrying about money or uncertainty. "Just some grown-up problems," Noah said gently. "Nothing for you to worry about." But Clara could see the weight of impossible decisions in Noah's expression. Choose financial security for Milo or continue fighting for Ivy's sight. Accept corporate control or risk losing everything in a battle against forces with unlimited resources and political influence. The fiber-optic garden waited in the greenhouse, its thousands of gentle lights ready for tomorrow's session if there was a tomorrow's session. The delicate strands represented more than therapeutic tools now. They were symbols of independence, of the right to pursue healing outside corporate boardrooms and bureaucratic oversight. As Clara prepared for bed that night, she found herself thinking about the corporate buyout contract and what it represented. $12 million was enough to change lives, to guarantee futures, to provide security that most people could only dream about. But some things, she was beginning to understand, were worth more than money. Some battles were worth fighting even when victory seemed impossible. Some hopes were worth protecting even when powerful forces aligned against them. Tomorrow would bring the formal hearing that could end Ivy's treatment permanently. Tonight, Clara fell asleep, planning defiance, preparing to fight for the right to choose hope over security, possibility over profit, and the chance that sometimes impossible cures came from unexpected places. The corporate contract lay on her kitchen table like a test of values, challenging everything she'd believed about the price of progress and the cost of standing up to forces that measured success only in dollars and market share. The bicentennial lanterns arrived at dawn, delivered by the same volunteers who had transformed the abandoned greenhouse into a sanctuary of light and hope. Hundreds of fairy lights in mason jars, each one carefully wired and tested, ready to illuminate Willow Creek's town square for the celebration that had been planned for months. Clara stood at her office window watching the setup, knowing that tonight's festivities would serve as the backdrop for the most important speech of her political career. But the lanterns represented more than decoration. Hidden among the celebration supplies were the portable components of Noah's therapy, equipment carefully disguised and distributed by supporters who understood that tonight might be their last chance to prove that impossible cures sometimes came from impossible circumstances. The formal hearing had ended badly. Dr. Rodriguez and her team had issued a cease and desist order that made continuing Ivy's treatment a criminal offense punishable by fines and potential imprisonment. Noah's equipment had been officially sealed, his protocols declared unsafe, his credentials questioned by experts who had never witnessed the progress Ivy had made. Effective immediately, Dr. Rodriguez had announced with bureaucratic finality, "All experimental vision therapy must cease. Dr. Hart is prohibited from conducting any further medical procedures within the state pending a complete review of his qualifications and methods." Clara had watched Noah's face during the pronouncement, seeing the defeat settle into his expression like dust after an explosion. 6 weeks of breakthrough progress, documented improvements that defied medical consensus, hope rebuilt from the ruins of professional certainty, of it declared invalid by officials who valued compliance over results. But Margaret Henley had been busy during the hearing, quietly organizing a network of supporters who understood that sometimes rules needed to be broken in service of larger truths. By evening, half the town knew about the plan to smuggle Noah's equipment to the bicentennial celebration, to give Ivy one final chance to demonstrate what conventional medicine claimed was impossible. "It's completely crazy, Dr." Sarah Chen admitted as she helped disguise neural monitoring equipment as sound system components. "If we're caught, my medical license could be revoked." "If we don't try," Clara replied, "Ivy loses the chance to see again. Which risk seems more worth taking?" The town square filled with families as evening approached, children running between the lantern displays, while adults gathered around food booths and the makeshift stage where Clara would deliver her speech. The atmosphere was festive, celebratory, touched with the kind of community pride that made small-town gatherings feel like family reunions. But underneath the celebration ran currents of tension that only the initiated could detect. Noah moved through the crowd like a ghost, his medical equipment concealed in guitar cases and speaker boxes, his expression grave with the knowledge that tonight's demonstration would either vindicate 6 weeks of progress or confirm the skeptics' claims that hope without official sanction was inherently dangerous. Milo stayed close to his father, carrying a backpack that contained the fiber-optic components with the solemnity of a boy who understood that grown-up plans sometimes required children to be braver than seemed fair. His friendship with Ivy had become one of the constants in both their lives, and the possibility that tonight might end their time together added urgency to every shared glance and whispered conversation. "Are you scared?" Ivy asked as they stood together near the gazebo stage, surrounded by the controlled chaos of pre-celebration setup. "Terrified," Milo admitted with the honesty that children brought to impossible situations. "But Dad says being scared doesn't mean you can't do important things. It just means the things are really important." Clara found herself checking her speech notes for the dozenth time, though she knew the words by heart. The text she'd prepared for the bicentennial celebration had been rewritten to serve a different purpose note, just commemorating Willow Creek's history, but defending its future, not just celebrating past achievements, but arguing for the right to pursue present miracles. 200 years ago, her speech would begin, our founders came to this valley because they believed in possibilities that others called impossible. They believed that hard work, determination, and hope could overcome any obstacle. Tonight, we face a test of whether we still share that faith. The lanterns were tested and retested, their warm glow creating pools of light throughout the square. But Clara's attention was drawn to the gazebo stage, where the most important lights would soon be activated, the carefully concealed therapy equipment that would either prove Ivy's progress or expose them all to charges of reckless endangerment. As sunset approached, Dr. BC's 1174. Rodriguez appeared at the edge of the crowd, accompanied by two state health officials and what appeared to be a court officer with legal documents that Clara didn't want to examine too closely. Their presence added weight to the evening's proceedings, transforming what should have been a community celebration into a high-stakes confrontation between hope and authority. "Mayor Dawson," Dr. Rodriguez called out with the kind of professional courtesy that carried implicit threats. "I trust you understand that any continuation of experimental medical procedures would constitute a violation of the cease and desist order. I understand that tonight is about celebrating our community's history and future," Clara replied carefully. "Nothing more, nothing less." But Dr. Rodriguez's expression suggested she wasn't fooled by diplomatic language. Her team positioned themselves strategically around the square, close enough to intervene if they detected any unauthorized medical activity. Noah caught Clara's eye from across the crowd, his expression asking the question that would determine everything: proceed with the demonstration despite the official presence, or abandon the plan and accept that bureaucracy had triumphed over breakthrough. Clara thought about the corporate buyout contract that still sat on Noah's motel room table, about the $12 million that could change Milo's life forever, about the safety and security that came with accepting defeat gracefully. Then she thought about Ivy's progress through the fiber-optic garden, about the wind chimes she'd learned to navigate, about the patterns of light her brain had started to recognize after 3 years of absolute darkness. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. Clara nodded slightly, giving Noah the signal to proceed with their carefully orchestrated plan. Whatever consequences followed, whatever legal troubles emerged, whatever political costs she paid tonight, they would give Ivy one final chance to show the world that impossible cures sometimes came from impossible circumstances. The bicentennial lanterns glowed softly in their mason jars, each one a small beacon of hope in the gathering darkness. Soon, they would be joined by other therapeutic lights, disguised as celebration, experimental equipment, masquerading as entertainment, the tools of vision recovery, hidden in plain sight among the symbols of community pride. Clara climbed the steps to the gazebo stage, her speech notes feeling heavy in her hand. In a few minutes, she would begin the most important presentation of her life, not just defending Ivy's treatment, but arguing for the broader principle that hope should never be sacrificed to bureaucratic convenience. The crowd gathered closer as she approached the microphone, families with children, elderly couples holding hands, teenagers texting while pretending not to listen. This was her community, her responsibility, her chance to show that leadership sometimes meant risking everything for the possibility of extraordinary outcomes. Behind her, carefully concealed among the celebration equipment, Noah's therapy devices waited for activation. The fiber-optic components were woven through the lantern displays, the neural monitoring equipment disguised as sound system components, the light therapy apparatus hidden in festival decorations. Dr. Rodriguez watched from the crowd's edge, her official authority poised to intervene at the first sign of unauthorized medical activity. The court officer stood ready with legal documents that could end everything before it started. But Clara had spent 6 weeks watching impossible progress unfold in an abandoned greenhouse. 6 weeks learning that sometimes hope was stronger than professional certainty. 6 weeks preparing for this moment when community support would either triumph over bureaucratic opposition or collapse under the weight of official disapproval. She stepped up to the microphone, her speech notes steady in her hand despite the magnitude of what they were about to attempt. The bicentennial lanterns cast gentle shadows across faces she'd known for years, creating an atmosphere of warmth and possibility that bureaucrats couldn't regulate and corporations couldn't control. "Good evening, Willow Creek," she began, her voice carrying across the square with the confidence of someone who had decided that some battles were worth fighting, regardless of the odds. "Tonight, we celebrate not just our past, but our faith in the future." The gazebo stage had been transformed into something between a political platform and a medical theater, its wooden railings draped with fairy lights that served dual purposes: celebration and therapy. Clara stood at the microphone, her prepared speech giving way to words that came from deeper places than political calculation. 200 years ago, our founders believed in possibilities that others called impossible, she said, her voice carrying across the packed town square. They came to this valley with nothing but hope and determination, convinced that extraordinary outcomes could emerge from ordinary commitment. The crowd listened with the focused attention that small communities brought to important occasions. Children sat on parents' shoulders, elderly residents claimed the best viewing spots, and teenagers pretended not to care while listening intently. But Clara's attention was drawn to the edges of the gathering, where Dr. Rodriguez and her team watched with the vigilance of officials expecting protocol violations. "Tonight, we face our own test of faith in the impossible," Clara continued, her speech notes abandoned in favor of words that felt more authentic than anything she'd prepared. "6 weeks ago, my daughter Ivy couldn't distinguish between light and darkness. Every medical expert we consulted told us that her blindness was permanent, irreversible, beyond the reach of current technology." She paused, letting the words settle among listeners who had watched Ivy navigate blindness with grace and determination. Many of them remembered the bright, fearless girl who had climbed every tree in Willow Creek before her world went dark. Then Dr. Noah Hart arrived, with his converted school bus clinic, and a promise that sounded like madness, that experimental therapy might help Ivy's brain remember how to see. The medical establishment said it was impossible. The bureaucrats said it was dangerous. The skeptics said it was false hope. Clara gestured toward the crowd, where Noah stood with Milo beside him, both father and son, looking like they were preparing for either vindication or exile. "But sometimes," Clara said, her voice growing stronger, "the impossible becomes possible when communities choose courage over caution, when families choose hope over acceptance, when ordinary people decide that expert opinion isn't the final word on what miracles can unfold." The crowd stirred as Ivy appeared at the base of the gazebo steps, her white cane folded in her hand, but her posture suggesting she might not need it for what came next. The fairy lights surrounding the stage began to pulse in carefully programmed patterns, Noah's fiber optic therapy disguised as celebration lighting. Dr. Rodriguez stepped forward from the crowd's edge, her voice carrying official authority across the square. "Mayor Dawson, I must remind you that any experimental medical procedures are strictly prohibited under the cease and desist order." "This isn't a medical procedure," Clara replied firmly. "This is a community celebration. My daughter is simply participating in our bicentennial festivities." But everyone present understood that something more significant was unfolding. The fairy lights had been arranged in the same patterns Ivy had learned to recognize in the greenhouse geometric shapes and flowing designs that challenged her recovering vision to distinguish between planned illumination and random decoration. Ivy climbed the gazebo steps with careful confidence, her movements guided by weeks of practice in navigating light-enhanced environments. The stage had been wired with the same therapeutic frequencies she'd grown accustomed to, creating a controlled testing environment disguised as patriotic pageantry. "For 6 weeks," Clara continued, her speech becoming a real-time narration of the demonstration unfolding before them, "Ivy has been working with Dr. Hart to retrain her brain's ability to process visual information. Not to repair damaged optic nerves that truly is impossible, but to teach her neural pathways to interpret the signals that remain." The crowd watched in fascination as Ivy moved across the stage, her face turned upward toward the carefully arranged lights. The fairy light patterns grew more complex, shifting from simple geometric shapes to flowing designs that required sophisticated visual processing to follow and interpret. "She's tracking the light patterns," whispered someone from the crowd, the observation carrying clearly in the evening air. Dr. Rodriguez spoke urgently into a handheld radio, clearly calling for backup or legal intervention. The court officer moved closer to the stage, legal documents ready to serve if the demonstration crossed the line from celebration into unauthorized medical activity. But Clara pressed forward, understanding that this moment would either vindicate everything they'd worked toward or destroy their credibility forever. The medical experts said Ivy would never distinguish between light and shadow again. But watch. Clara gestured toward her daughter, who had positioned herself at the center of the stage where the light patterns were most complex. The fairy lights shifted into a new configuration, a starfield pattern that required not just light detection, but spatial reasoning and pattern recognition. Ivy stood perfectly still for a moment, her face turned toward the lights with an expression of intense concentration. Then, slowly, she began to point to specific areas of the display. "There," she said clearly enough for the crowd to hear. "A star, another one there, and there they're making the Big Dipper." The crowd's collective intake of breath was audible. Ivy was identifying individual points of light within a complex pattern, describing spatial relationships that required genuine vision rather than wishful thinking or lucky guessing. Dr. Rodriguez's radio crackled with urgent communications, but the official intervention seemed frozen by the magnitude of what was unfolding. The court officer stood ready to act, but the legal distinction between medical treatment and public demonstration had become too blurred to navigate easily. Noah stepped onto the stage, no longer bothering to conceal his role in the evening's events. "What you're witnessing," he announced to the crowd, "is proof that the human brain's capacity for adaptation exceeds what conventional medicine believes possible." The fairy lights shifted again, this time forming a pattern that only someone with functional vision could navigate, a maze of illuminated pathways that required real-time visual processing to follow successfully. "Ivy," Noah said gently, "can you follow the lighted path from where you're standing to the opposite side of the stage?" The challenge was significant. The light maze required not just pattern recognition, but dynamic visual tracking, spatial reasoning, and the ability to coordinate movement with visual input skills that medical experts had declared permanently lost. Ivy studied the light pattern for a moment, then began to move. Her steps were careful but confident, following the illuminated pathway with precision that left no doubt about her ability to see and interpret the visual guidance system. The crowd watched in absolute silence as she navigated the light maze, turning at the correct corners, avoiding the unlit areas, following the pattern with an accuracy that statistical analysis would later confirm was impossible without genuine visual function. When she reached the end of the maze and turned to face the crowd, the applause that erupted was spontaneous and overwhelming. People who had known Ivy since childhood stood and cheered, their emotion a mixture of joy, amazement, and relief that impossible things sometimes happened to deserving families. The moment of first sight came not with dramatic fanfare, but with the quiet intensity of dawn breaking after the longest night. Ivy stood at the center of the gazebo stage, surrounded by the pulsing fairy lights that had guided her through the maze, her face turned toward Clara with an expression of wondering concentration. "Mum," she said softly, her voice carrying across the hushed crowd, "I can see you." The words hung in the evening air like a bridge between the world Ivy had lost and the world she was reclaiming. Clara felt her breath catch, her heart hammering against her ribs as she looked into her daughter's eyes and saw recognition there, not the spatial awareness of someone tracking sound, but the focused attention of genuine sight. "Tell me what you see," Clara whispered, stepping closer to the stage. Ivy's face broke into a smile that transformed her entire appearance. "Your hair, it's different than I remembered, more silver, and you're crying, but you're happy. I can see that you're happy." The crowd's emotional response was immediate and overwhelming. Parents hugged their children, elderly couples wiped away tears, and even the teenagers stopped pretending not to care as they witnessed something that transcended ordinary celebration. Dr. Rodriguez stood frozen at the crowd's edge, her official authority suddenly irrelevant in the face of documented progress that conventional medicine had declared impossible. The court officer lowered his legal documents, clearly uncertain whether to intervene in what appeared to be a genuine medical breakthrough. Noah moved to stand beside Ivy, his equipment finally revealed for what it truly was: not hidden, contraband but sophisticated therapy technology that had achieved results the medical establishment claimed couldn't exist. "What Ivy has accomplished," he announced to the crowd, "represents 6 weeks of dedicated work to retrain neural pathways that were damaged but not destroyed. Her progress proves that the brain's capacity for adaptation exceeds what conventional medicine currently understands." The fairy lights continued their therapeutic patterns, but now their purpose was clear: not disguised medical treatment, but validated therapy that had produced measurable results. The corporate buyout contract that had seemed so tempting that morning now felt like betrayal of everything Noah had worked to achieve. Milo bounded onto the stage with the irrepressible joy of childhood, his paper airplane clutched in his hand. "Ivy, can you really see? Can you see my airplane?" Ivy turned toward him, her focus sharp and sure. "It's blue and white," she said with growing confidence, "and you folded the wings to look like a hawk." The specific details of Milo's carefully crafted airplane colors and shapes that could only be perceived through genuine vision provided objective confirmation that Ivy's sight had truly returned. This wasn't wishful thinking or hopeful interpretation. This was documented visual function, restored through experimental therapy that experts had dismissed as impossible. Clara climbed onto the stage, moving slowly so as not to disrupt the therapeutic lighting, her eyes never leaving Ivy's face. After 3 years of wondering what her daughter might see if vision returned, she was finally getting answers. "What else can you see?" Clara asked softly. Ivy turned in a slow circle, taking in the transformed town square with the wonder of someone seeing familiar places for the first time. "The people, so many people, and they're all looking at us. Mrs. Henderson is crying. Mr. Patterson is taking pictures." She paused, her voice filling with emotion. "Everyone looks different than I remembered, but the same too. Like coming home after a really long trip." The crowd responded with renewed applause, but the celebration was interrupted by Dr. Rodriguez stepping forward with the determined expression of someone whose professional worldview had just been fundamentally challenged. "This is unprecedented," she admitted, her bureaucratic composure cracking in the face of evidence that contradicted everything she'd been taught about permanent vision loss. "I need to document this, to understand how." "How it's possible," Noah interjected gently. "The same way all medical breakthroughs become possible through careful research, innovative thinking, and the willingness to challenge assumptions about what can and can't be healed." The corporate representatives who had been monitoring the situation from the crowd's periphery melted away into the evening shadows, their plans for acquiring Noah's therapy suddenly complicated by public demonstration of its effectiveness. The buyout offer that had seemed so appealing that morning now looked like exactly what Clara had suspected: an attempt to control breakthrough medical technology before its full potential could be realized. "Dr. Hart," Dr. Rodriguez said formally, "I believe we need to reassess our earlier conclusions about your treatment protocols." The admission represented more than bureaucratic face-saving. It acknowledged that sometimes experimental approaches succeeded where conventional medicine failed, that innovation required tolerance for methods that didn't fit established patterns. As the official tension began to dissipate, the community celebration resumed with renewed energy. But now the fairy lights served their intended dual purpose, honoring Willow Creek's bicentennial while illuminating the ongoing miracle of Ivy's recovered sight. Clara found herself standing beside Noah as they watched Ivy and Milo chase each other through the light displays, her daughter's movements confident and joyful in ways that had seemed impossible just hours earlier. "The corporate offer," Clara said quietly. "Are you still considering it?" Noah's answer came without hesitation. $12 million isn't worth more than this," he said, gesturing toward Ivy's delighted laughter as she successfully caught one of Milo's paper airplanes. "Some things can't be bought, controlled, or regulated into corporate compliance." The bicentennial celebration continued around them, but Clara knew that the evening had become about more than commemorating Willow Creek's past. It had become a testament to the community's faith in possibilities that experts called impossible, a demonstration that sometimes hope backed by determination could achieve extraordinary outcomes. As the fairy lights pulsed in their therapeutic patterns, creating beauty and healing in equal measure, Clara realized that the moment would be remembered not just for Ivy's recovered sight, but for the broader principle it represented that innovation flourished when communities supported bold experiments, that breakthroughs came from unlikely places, and that sometimes the most important miracles happened in small towns, willing to risk everything for the chance that impossible cures might be possible after all. 6 months later, the blended family photo sat framed on Clara's desk, capturing a moment that would have seemed impossible the year before. Clara and Noah stood together in the greenhouse that had become a permanent vision therapy center, while Ivy and Milo flanked them with the easy confidence of siblings who had found each other across the boundaries of biological family. The photograph represented more than personal happiness. It documented the transformation that had rippled through Willow Creek since the night of the bicentennial celebration. What had begun as an experimental treatment for one blind teenager had evolved into a recognized therapy center that drew patients and researchers from across the country. Dr. Hart's Vision Recovery Institute. Read the modest sign outside the former greenhouse, though Noah had insisted on including "in partnership with Willow Creek Community" in smaller text below. The clinic operated as a collaboration between cutting-edge medical research and small-town support, proving that innovation flourished when expertise combined with community commitment. Ivy's vision continued to improve, though she would never achieve the perfect sight that sighted people took for granted. Her world remained softer around the edges, colors less vivid than typical perception, but rich enough to include her mother's face, Milo's drawings, and the sunset views from their new home that overlooked the valley where Willow Creek had grown for 2 centuries. "I can see well enough to know that you're worrying about something," Ivy said from the doorway of Clara's office, her perceptiveness enhanced by years of reading emotional cues through non-visual channels. Clara looked up from the latest batch of applications from patients seeking treatment at Noah's clinic. The success of Ivy's case had generated both wonderful opportunities and complex responsibilities. Families arrived weekly with children whose blindness had been declared permanent, hoping for miracles that Noah could provide for some, but not all. "Just reviewing the new patient files," Clara replied. "Dr. Hart says we have enough applicants to keep the clinic busy for years." Ivy entered the office with the confident movement of someone whose spatial awareness combined recovered vision with learned navigation skills. At 15, she had adapted to her improved but imperfect sight, with the same grace she'd shown in adapting to blindness. "Mom, you know that not everyone will get better the way I did, right?" Ivy said gently, "And that's not a failure, it's just medicine. Some things work, some things don't, but trying is always worth it." The wisdom in her daughter's words reminded Clara why the clinic had become so important. Even when Noah's therapy didn't restore sight, it provided hope, community, and the knowledge that someone was still fighting for patients whom conventional medicine had given up on. Clara's re-election had been decisive, with even former critics acknowledging that her support for experimental treatment had brought positive attention and economic development to Willow Creek. The Vision Therapy Center employed 12 people, attracted visiting researchers, and generated the kind of medical tourism that transformed small-town budgets. But more important than political vindication was the personal transformation that had touched everyone involved. Noah's practice had evolved from traveling medicine to permanent community partnership. Milo had traded the uncertainty of constant travel for the stability of a real home, excellent schools, and the big sister he'd always wanted. "Dad says the new family from Oregon should arrive this afternoon," Milo announced, appearing in the office doorway with the kind of official information that 8-year-olds delivered with impressive authority. "Their daughter has the same condition Ivy had, but she's only been blind for 6 months. Recent onset cases often responded better to Noah's therapy, offering higher probability of significant improvement. But even patients with long-standing blindness sometimes achieved meaningful progress enough to navigate familiar environments, distinguish between light and shadow, recognize faces and expressions that had been lost to darkness. The greenhouse clinic had become a pilgrimage destination for families seeking alternatives to medical certainty. Clara often stood at her office window, watching new arrivals unload suitcases and hope in equal measure, remembering her own first meeting with Noah and the desperate willingness to try anything that might help Ivy see again. The corporate buyout offer had been withdrawn after the bicentennial demonstration, Neurovision Technologies apparently deciding that publicly validated therapy was harder to control than experimental procedures that could be dismissed as unproven. Noah had turned down subsequent offers from other companies, choosing instead to develop his methods through university partnerships that prioritized research over profit. "Mrs. Dawson," came Margaret's voice through the intercom. "The reporter from Medical Research Today is here for the follow-up interview." The media attention had been overwhelming initially, but Clara had learned to manage it as part of their new reality. Ivy's case had been documented in peer-reviewed journals, presented at medical conferences, and featured in news stories that emphasized both the breakthrough success and the careful scientific method that had made it possible. As Clara prepared for the interview, she found herself thinking about the journey that had brought them to this moment. The stack of medical files declaring Ivy's blindness permanent still sat in her desk drawer, not as reminders of limitation, but as evidence that expert opinion wasn't always the final word on what could be healed. The interview went well, focusing on the collaboration between innovative medical research and community support that had made Noah's work possible. Clara emphasized that Willow Creek's contribution had been the willingness to take calculated risks for extraordinary outcomes, to support unconventional approaches when conventional medicine had exhausted its options. That evening, the four of them gathered for dinner in the house that Clara and Noah had purchased together, a Victorian farmhouse with enough space for blended family complexity and the kind of front porch that encouraged conversations about shared futures. "Dad, can you help me with my science project?" Milo asked over dessert. "I want to study how light therapy works. Miss Patterson said I could interview you for extra credit." Noah smiled at his son's scientific curiosity, understanding that Milo's childhood had been shaped by witnessing medical miracles unfold through careful research and determined application. "What's your hypothesis?" "That helping people see again is mostly about not giving up." Milo replied with the matter-of-fact wisdom that children sometimes achieved, even when really smart people say it's impossible. Clara and Ivy exchanged glances across the dinner table, both remembering the dark period when hope had seemed like a luxury they couldn't afford. The house filled with the comfortable noise of family conversation, homework questions, weekend plans, the kind of ordinary concerns that had seemed impossible when Ivy's future was uncertain and Noah's treatment was under attack. Later, as they walked through Willow Creek's evening streets, Clara marveled at how much had changed in 6 months. The town square still featured the gazebo, where Ivy had first demonstrated her recovered sight, now equipped with permanent, therapeutic lighting that served double duty as community decoration and medical equipment. "I never thanked you properly," Clara said to Noah, as they watched Ivy and Milo practice basketball in the driveway. Her daughter's shots guided by vision that would never be perfect, but was sufficient for the games that mattered. "For what?" Noah asked. "For keeping your promise, for giving me back my daughter's sight, for staying when you could have taken the corporate offer and been financially secure for life." Noah considered her words carefully. "I kept my promise to Ivy, but you gave me something more valuable than any corporate contract could offer. You gave me a home, a community, a place where Milo can grow up, believing that impossible things sometimes happen when people care enough to make them possible." The blended family photo on Clara's desk had been taken on moving day, all four of them exhausted but hopeful as they carried boxes into the house that would become their shared home. But the real significance of the image wasn't the documentation of domestic arrangements, it was the evidence that love could expand to include unexpected people, that families could form across biological boundaries, that hope shared was hope multiplied. As they stood watching their children play in the fading light, Clara understood that the miracle hadn't been just Ivy's recovered sight. The miracle had been the way their lives had intertwined to create something richer and more complex than any of them could have achieved alone. The greenhouse clinic continued its work, helping some patients achieve dramatic improvements, while offering others the smaller victories of enhanced light perception or improved spatial awareness. But success wasn't measured only in degrees of vision. Restored it was measured in hope maintained, in families supported, in the demonstration that conventional wisdom wasn't always the final word on what healing could accomplish. Tomorrow would bring new patients, new challenges, new opportunities to prove that innovation flourished when communities supported bold experiments. Tonight, Clara fell asleep, grateful for the impossible circumstances that had brought Noah and Milo into their lives, creating a family that couldn't have been planned, but couldn't be improved upon. The blended family photo remained on her desk, capturing not just four people who had learned to see each other clearly, but the moment when impossible became possible through the simple decision to believe that hope, backed by determination, could achieve extraordinary outcomes in the most ordinary places.